Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be getting into episodes 638 through 640, which will cover manga chapters 709 through 712. And things are starting to heat up in Dressrosa with the B block of the Corrida tournament concluding and the rest of our alliance getting closer to the enemy. So, synopsis. The B block comes to a shocking end with a very unlikely winner coming out on top, with Luffy's C block next. And in the meantime, the Caesar drop-off crew make it past the fighting fish-infested waters to make it to the green bit, while Sanji finds himself in hot water with a surprise betrayal and trap waiting for him. Alright, so differences. There really aren't too many major differences. It's just that there are a lot of filler scenes added to extend many sequences and just kind of add a little bit more time and padding to sort of draw everything out. But the only real big difference is that the last third of the episode 639 is pretty much entirely filler, kind of expanding on the scene where Violet tries to betray Sanji. In the manga, all of this is pretty much skipped over, and chapter 712 begins with Violet having revealed herself to be part of the Doflamingo family, or the Don Quixote family. And yeah, so I don't really mind this type of filler though. It does help explain a bit more about how Sanji was defeated so quickly. And in the manga, the way it's presented, it's also fine too, as you can kind of infer that, Violet, being a woman, did something to take advantage of him to get him caught. And so yeah, it's whether you want to leave that up to your imagination or whether you want to explicitly explain to you. I think both are fine. So yeah, I don't really mind this filler addition, to be quite honest. Interestingly, though, this scene in the manga is also told as a slight flashback. Because you can tell, because in the manga, it's surrounded by the gray background, which is usually used for short-term flashbacks or flashbacks within a flashback, while the black backgrounds are full-on, full flashbacks. And I can't quite explain why this was used here because the other part of this isn't actually shown in this episode, but there is a reason why the gray background is used in the manga. But the anime treats this moment as if it was happening in real time in chronological order. So I guess it really doesn't matter all that much, but yeah, it is an interesting story telling mechanic change. So with that being said, let's get into the episodes and my thoughts. And so yeah, the B block is in full swing with Bartolomeo counterattacking Hack and taking him out of the fight. Shortly after that, Blue Gilly takes down Ricky, but one curious thing that Blue Gilly mentions about Ricky is that he's using a blunt blade, meaning that he is trying to win, but doing this without killing anyone and only subduing them, making him even more suspiciously like a good guy, which made me think that this was actually Kyros in disguise. Blue Gilly, in a twist, has been revealed to be working with Dagama and continues to thin the fighters out and betrays the other group of regular fighters he recruited to protect Elisabello. But Blue Gilly also has his own plans as he then turns on Dagama and knocks him out. And so you get this betrayal on top of a betrayal, which is pretty funny. Now it pretty much comes down to Blue Gilly, King Elisabello, Bellamy, and Bartolomeo. And it's too funny just seeing Elisabello just standing there, unable to really do anything other than just shadow box the whole time. And it's here we get to see the matchup that has now developed into probably the most interesting of this block, which is Bellamy versus Bartolomeo. However, unfortunate for Bellamy, whatever power Bartolomeo has, it prevents anyone from attacking him, as every time anyone tries to hit him, they immediately get blown back like he's being protected by some sort of an invisible force field, which we'll soon learn about. And crazily enough, Luffy even starts to cheer on Bellamy, which is really interesting. But Elisabello has finally finished charging up his King Punch, and I remember doing this. I was thinking with how hyped up this punch was. I remember thinking to myself, this thing had better be as advertised and stupid strong, or at least a really funny subversive joke. Turns out the real thing was, in fact, it was pretty stupidly strong, causing an explosion that wipes out pretty much everyone on the battlefield except for one. But I do kind of think that it was slightly disappointing to me, but it was right there. I think it was fine. And then we're finally introduced to Bartolomeo's Devil Fruit. the bari bari no mi, or the barrier fruit. Bari is just the first half of barrier in Japanese, or baria. And so this allows him to create the near impenetrable barriers by crossing his fingers. And Bartolomeo does explain why it's the finger crossing that activates it, as in Japanese culture, particularly with little kids, it's a thing that they do to basically put up an imaginary barrier to repel bad things or taunt people that a lot of like delinquent kids do. Kind of like how in America we have the sort of the talk to the hand gesture, where you put up your palm in front of someone's face and it basically just creates this like, oh, you're not getting anything past me type of thing. It's similar to that. And this fits in line with Bartolomeo's sort of persona of being like a delinquent thug. At first, the barrier was invisible to kind of maintain the mystery, but here we do get to see that it is a dark glass window, like a projection that he puts out. And that's what's causing everyone to basically like get blown back. They keep hitting that thing, but they can't get through it. It'll be interesting to see what the limits are of the bari bari no mi, because like right now it seems like it can withstand quite a bit. But I'm sure if like haki was infused, maybe it could break through it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the limits are of this fruit. But we can see that not only is it used for defense, but it can be used offensively as well, as we see that Bartolomeo can launch them at people and basically ram them with a wall for some devastating damage as well. With that, Bartolomeo wins the B block round to everyone's dismay. And I gotta say though, watching this with hindsight, it really does change the tone a bit, knowing what happens with all these characters later on. Another aspect that I really love about the Corrida Colosseum is getting to see Oda really flex his creativity in the variety of different types of characters and combat styles he puts on display here. They're not just general fodder with generic fighting styles. Each one has like their own distinct style, look, and personalities. And that definitely does not seem like an easy thing to do. And yet he creates like more than 24 plus characters throughout the entire Dressrosa arc and really gives them a lot. Actually, probably even more than that now that I think about it. Like way more. So many characters get introduced in Dressrosa. It's insane. After the B block round, there's a somewhat of a nice moment between Bellamy and Luffy, where as Bellamy is being stretchered away, he laments being cheered on by Luffy, and then expressing frustration that nothing's changed, referring to his lack of strength. But Luffy reassures him that he has changed, but of course Luffy is referring to the fact that Bellamy's character has changed for the better, and Luffy, with his great emotional intelligence, he can see that Bellamy is a better person. At first, Bellamy seems annoyed as he grits his teeth, but then he lets it go and a smile comes across his face. And the way I always took this is that at first he thought Luffy was still talking about his strength and patronizing him, but quickly realizes that he's talking about him as a person. And Bellamy, still having that sort of stubborn, prideful streak to him, without acknowledging it, changes the subject to saying how Luffy has changed and grown in strength, saying how strong his haki is now, which apparently he can sense. One thing about Bellamy is that it's very apparent how, to him, the value of strength being the top is how he views the world, and it shows how following a man like Doflamingo has instilled that sort of the might is right mentality. We even got to see a couple examples of it already. For example, where he was punished by Doflamingo back on Jaya for being defeated by Luffy during the Skypiea arc. But you can tell that this is a turning point for Bellamy, where he begins to not only kind of admire Luffy, it seems like, a little bit, and the cracks in his worldview start to form. And it'll be interesting to see how he responds to Doflamingo later, or at least that's how I thought at the time. It's nuts how Oda can deepen a character so much without it even being explicitly said. Like sometimes Oda is incredibly on the nose and just has characters say things out loud and what they're thinking. But then there are moments like this where everything can be read between the lines, more so than what's actually being said. And I do like these scenes, and I think that both are fine. But it is nice to be able to see some of these more sort of subtle scenes. I didn't mention this in the differences section, but there is one slight difference in the manga compared to the anime here in the dialogue that I always was curious about why it changed, because in the manga, the tone of this conversation is a bit different. Instead of starting off the conversation straight up asking why he cheered or why Luffy cheered him on, like he does in the anime. In the manga, he ends the conversation almost with "and you had the gall to cheer me on." And Luffy responds, "Did I?" And then Bellamy responds back to him, "Now my pride is shattered." This change does kind of change the tone and even the character a bit, because I feel that Bellamy, being as stubborn and prideful as he is, wouldn't just straight up ask him this like he's seeking validation from Luffy in the way that it's depicted in the anime. And this also makes it so that Luffy just kind of instinctively cheered Bellamy on, but didn't really think much of it. And it was a more like natural and reflexive thing that Luffy wanted to do when he saw someone giving it their all in an honest and sincere effort. Like, it's a very minor change, but it does kind of take away from Bellamy's sort of development a little bit, the way the dialogue was shuffled around and changed a bit. This scene, though, ends on a slight cliffhanger as Bellamy refers to Luffy as Straw Hat within earshot of Bartolomeo, to which he has a visibly strong reaction, to setting up a scenario where we have potentially another really strong fighter who might have beef with Luffy as well, just like Cavendish and Chinjao had. The scene then shifts to the Caesar drop-off team, where they're in process of crossing the bridge over the fighting fish-infested waters. But unlike the ones found at the Corrida Colosseum, these fighting fish are like 20 times bigger and can nearly bust through steel walls. And this is a fun and funny scene, with Usopp freaking out over having to deal with the fish alongside Robin and a coerced Caesar to protect them. But the most interesting detail from this scene is Law and his refusal to use his powers, despite it being one of the more OP fruits and probably could have easily gotten them out of trouble here. But he explains that he can't use his powers because he needs to save his strength due to the fact that the more he uses it, the more it drains his stamina. And the reason this is interesting is because it's the first time we've seen a fruit's power tied to the user's stamina. I could be wrong, but I don't believe up till now we haven't really had a fruit's effectiveness diminish the more it's used. Like, Luffy can stretch as much as he wants and doesn't really get tired from the simple act of stretching, or of course he has a limit to how far he can stretch, but that's more of a maximum limitation of the stretching, more so than him getting too tired to stretch. And we've even seen Luffy being stretched even when he himself was too exhausted to move. Like at the end of NES Lobby, Luffy was completely drained from his fight with Lucci and couldn't move, yet Sanji and Zoro still used him as a net to launch back cannonballs. And also, Logia users so far have never seemed to become exhausted the more they use their powers. Like, it's not like, Ace was able to produce less fire when he got tired. In fact, even when he was at his limits in his duel with Blackbeard, he produced his largest attack yet, the Dai Enkai Ente, where he basically produces an entire sun out of nothing. And I suppose the out-of-universe reason is that Oda probably realized how overpowered the Ope Ope fruit was, and so he created a way to somewhat keep it in check by having it be a very exhausting power to use. I also think it helps answer the question of how big can Law make the room. Up till this point, we haven't really seen what the limits of that are. I always wondered if Law could just make his room near infinite, but we now know that that's not the case unless he trains his own stamina and more efficient, his efficiency of using the power. Also, rather interestingly, after this, they're saved from some unknown entity from the fighting fish, but when they're faced with the broken section of the bridge, Law has Caesar just fly them across the rest of the way, to which Robin funnily remarks, "We should have just done this to begin with," to which Caesar screams back, "Do you know how much gas energy it takes to fly 3 people? So it's here Caesar admits that his Logia fruit also requires his own energy and stamina that can be depleted. So it seems that many fruits have limits, but the people we've seen possess many of these fruits maybe have some crazy amount of training and stamina. Like, I can understand the admirals being so strong and strong enough to maintain their crazy output, but someone like Enel, who I don't see as nearly trained as an admiral, output massive amounts of energy without getting tired. Although Enel is pretty ripped, so maybe he did train somewhere. I don't know, who knows? But this mechanic, I will say, Oda uses very seldomly and only when the story requires it. So that's something to keep in mind. Now they finally make it to the Green Bit, which is this mysterious wild jungle island. And if that feels really random and kind of out of place from the rest of Dressrosa, like I've mentioned in the past, that's because it was originally planned to be its own separate island and story arc, but Oda's editors at Jump kind of told him he needed to cut some material. So instead of just cutting it out entirely, kind of like how Punk Hazard, the fire, and the ice island were mashed together, he does the same thing here with this arc, where he puts Dressrosa and the Green Bit basically mashed together in one arc. Once on Green Bit, they discover that there is a relatively unharmed marine ship docked at the coast, realizing that the Marines are aware they're there. And this is where it flashes back to Law telling Smoker that they're headed to Green Bit. Robin's reaction to this moment is sort of potentially hinting that maybe Law set them up, but to me it always seemed like Law was actually doing this to set Doffy up. He stripped Doflamingo of his Shibukai status to make it so that the Marines can go after him now, while setting up the meeting on Green Bit away from his defenses in Dressrosa, and then leaking that to Smoker on Punk Hazard would ensure that someone would be there to apprehend Doflamingo on Green Bit. Once Robin and Usopp begin to explore the forest, they encounter someone or something attacking a team of Marines after being shot at. They more or less mug them without actually touching them because they're so fast. Robin ends up catching one, and it turns out to be what the Dressrosa locals refer to as fairies, but they're actually little people. So now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have giants and we have these little tiny fairy people. Alongside this reveal, we also see that these are the same people that Zoro is currently chasing after, as one of them had stolen Shusui, but now Zoro has gotten it back and has kind of become friends with the little thief. And it's here we get to meet the cute Wicca, and she explains to Zoro and us that they are part of what she calls the Tontata people, or the Tontata tribe. And despite being tiny, they have immense physical strength, allowing them to crush stones with their tiny punches and even throwing Zoro over their shoulder. And later they display even more insane ability, as Wicca alone, in sort of a tantrum, almost levels an entire building. However, crazily enough, the Tontata people have been actually kind of foreshadowed all the way back in chapter 292 or episode 189, where during the Skypiea flashback of Noland, he mentions that he visited a country full of dwarves. And so it can be kind of assumed that Noland once got to Dressrosa, and particularly Green Bit, and actually met these folks, and that's who he's referring to, which is a very interesting foreshadow. Anyways, getting back to Wicca, she then lets it slip that she's been following the whereabouts of the Don Quixote family and traced one of them to the Thousand Sunny, which is what we saw at the end of episode 635 and that weird sort of abstract art portal thing we saw in the men's dormitory. Zoro has to make a deal with Wicca to have her guide him to the Sunny because Sanji, who was supposed to be there, isn't there, and he can't make it back there on his own. And I feel like it's here in Dressrosa, Zoro's lack of directional awareness goes from like 10 to 11. Like, he's absurdly bad at finding his way on Dressrosa. It's taken to an absurd level. I mean, he's always pretty comically bad, but he's literally like missing stairs and like turns that are like right in front of him. And speaking of Sanji, though, he's found himself in a precarious situation as he's been tricked and captured by Violet, who has revealed herself to be a member of the Don Quixote family. And Sanji, with his ability to see through a woman's lie, although this ability seems to disappear when it's convenient for the plot, but it was useful for things like seeing through Robin's betrayal at Water 7, for example. However, Violet literally can see through anyone, as she possesses the Giro Giro no Mi, or the Glare Glare fruit. Giro Giro is the Japanese onomatopoeia for like glaring at someone or staring at someone, or something, I suppose. The fruit seems to give her an enhanced sight in many different ways, like physically being able to see things like from a faraway distance, X-ray vision, but also the ability to see into someone's heart and mind to tell whether they're lying or not, which is no doubt a very useful ability to have for a crime boss like Doflamingo. There are, however, some minds you really shouldn't peer into for your own sake, and apparently that is the case with Sanji's mind. And this was an outcome where we were all aware of what would happen as soon as she mentioned this if she tried to look into Sanji's mind. Sanji's head is generally only filled with thoughts about women and lewd thoughts he has for them, which of course shocks Violet, but despite this, Sanji does have his moments, as without any sort of power, Sanji can still see into the hearts of women. Or more specifically, Sanji is just very trusting of women and has obsessed over them so much that he just instinctively can tell when they're in trouble or lying, which, again, I will reiterate that this perceptiveness is very inconsistent across the series, particularly later on. One thing I should mention here, because of how much it's memed over the years, is Violet's design in the anime. Specifically her bust size, because while Oda does draw her very voluptuous in the manga as well, the anime for some reason takes this to an absurd degree to make her waist even tinier and her breasts even more massive. And this first title card scene, truly introducing her, is a good example of this. Her cup size in the anime is like 4 or 5 sizes even bigger than her manga counterpart, which is crazy since in the manga she's already pretty well endowed to a ridiculous degree as is. Now, I'm fine with making characters attractive and sexy, but it is not necessary to go this overboard. Like between Violet and Rebecca, I feel like the perviness takes a huge leap for some reason in Dressrosa, and not for the better. And I need to confirm this, but I've read that it's due to the fact that the editor at the time kind of encouraged this of Oda. So I think that's why this happened. Now, finally, for these episodes, back at the Colosseum, they're getting ready to start the C block, which happens to be the block that Luffy's assigned to. And the fighters introduced in this block, two stand out to me. First is the bull, the brutal bull. Like, this just seems like a regular bull that's somehow intelligent enough to register themselves into a tournament like this. Like, did he enter himself in the tournament, or is this like a zone type fruit user? But he looks so much like just a regular bull. Like, all these thoughts ran through my head upon reading this for the first time. I was like, that's just a bull, isn't it? And of course we'll find out when we get to the C block section in the next set of episodes. The other one is a little bit more serious, and that's a giant from Elbaf, Hyrule. And we've finally met another giant from Elbaf, given their past history with Dory, Brogy, Oimo, and Kashi, it's pretty likely that this Hyrule may also play an interesting role in this arc, as, yeah, most of these folks from Elbaf will go on to play major roles, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this giant. Anyways, in closing, the plot is finally starting to move on, as many of the major players in the arc have been introduced, while several of our main characters are now in some dicey situations. And most of all, it is finally Luffy, or I should say Lucy's debut in the Corrida Colosseum, as we get set for Block C, which will be fun to see just how strong Luffy is against all these crazy people. But yeah, we'll end that here, and if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram, @SunnyGo Podcast, if you want updates of when I post new episodes. I know I haven't really been posting all that much. I will try and get back on that. But yeah, go ahead and check that out if you're interested. And as always, just listening to the podcast is enough for me, but if you feel like extra supporting me, please feel free to check out my Buy Me a Coffee profile. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. No spoiler section this week, so stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye.